Hello and welcome to the Run Testers. My name's Nick. In this video I'm going to be comparing the Polar Gritex 2 Pro to the Garmin Epix 2 and the Garmin Epix Pro. So, first, the reason why I'm comparing two Garmin watches. Well, for the most part, the Garmin Epix Pro and the Garmin Epix 2 are very similar. The newer Epix Pro comes in a range of sizes, all of which have flashlights, which you don't get on the Epix, and there's also a new heart rate sensor, but all the software features are otherwise the same, so I thought it makes sense to compare them both to the Polar Gritex 2 Pro, which is also an AMOLED sports watch that came out more recently. I've been wearing the Garmin Epix Pro for pretty much the entirety of the last year and used the Garmin Epix 2 for a long time before that. Obviously, we've had the Gritex 2 Pro in recently to test it ahead of our full review, so I've been testing that out over the last month or so. So with the Garmin Epix Pro, you've got three sizes: the smaller 42mm, the standard 47mm watch, which is the same size as the Epix 2, and then there's a larger 51mm Epix Pro, which is the one I was testing for the most part over the last year. That's the largest model in the range. All of them have an AMOLED touchscreen, as you'd expect, and the same 5-button design you always get with Garmin watches. The Polar Gritex 2 Pro is 48.6mm, so in between the larger two Epix sizes, and it's thinner than lighter than the Garmin watches across the board when you're comparing models made from equivalent materials. Epix Pro is expensive. It starts at £830 or $900 for the standard models, and that price rises up to £1,100 or dollars for the best sapphire titanium watch. Then the Epix 2 is a little bit cheaper. In fact, it's very cheap for the standard model in the UK at the moment. It's £400. It doesn't seem to be marked as a discount, but yeah, it's £400, whereas in the US it is $800, so quite a big jump in the US, and it's £800 or $900 for a sapphire model. The Polar is cheaper than the Epix Pro. It's £649 or $750 for the standard model, and it's £749 or $870 if you're looking at the Titan model, which is made from titanium. It's more in line with the Epix 2 pricing in general, especially when you look at the materials used. So with all of these watches, you've got base models that have steel cases and bezels, and then titanium models, the more expensive ones, they're called Titan in Polar's range. And then with the Garmin range, if you get a titanium model, you also get a sapphire crystal screen. And then with the Polar's range, you actually have sapphire crystal across both ranges. Whereas if you get one of the cheaper Garmins with the steel bezel, you get a Gorilla Glass screen. When it comes to the size of the screens, with the Garmins, it depends on the watch you get. So the smallest model has a 1.2 inch screen. It's 1.3 inch for the standard Epix Pro and the Garmin Epix 2. And it's 1.4 inch for the 51mm model. And the Polar Gritex 2 Pro screen is in line with the largest Garmin. So even though it's a smaller watch, it has an equivalent screen to the largest Garmin. Other little design differences: you've got a built-in flashlight on the Garmin Epix Pro, whereas the Garmin Epix 2 and the Polar Gritex 2 Pro have a flashlight mode that uses the screen that's not quite as bright and as useful as the built-in one on the Epix Pro. The Epix Pro and the Gritex 2 Pro have the latest heart rate monitors from their respective companies, and both of them are capable of taking an ECG, although with Garmin that's only in the US. With the Epix 2, you have a last gen optical heart rate monitor from Garmin. Obviously you can connect external sensors to all the watches. You can do that with Garmin watches via ANT Plus and Bluetooth, and just Bluetooth with the Polar. So multiband GPS is available on all the watches, although with the Epix 2 it's important to note it's only available on the more expensive Sapphire models. If you get the base Epix 2 model, it just has Garmin's all systems on GPS. It doesn't offer dual band like the Sapphire models, and indeed all models in the Gritex 2 and Epix Pro ranges. So as I said at the start, I've been using the Epix Pro for most of the last year, and I used the Epix 2 for a long time before that. I've got a long-term review of the Epix 2 up on the channel. I've been testing the Polar against both watches since it came out, mostly against the Garmin Epix Pro, and then recently against the Garmin Epix 2, just to compare them with real-world use. And I will say, for the most part, the Epix 2 and the Epix Pro performed very similar on really all counts, except the obviously physical differences you have there with the built-in flashlight and also the larger battery life of the 51mm model. We actually do have a full Epix versus Epix Pro video up on the channel if you want to just dive into the differences between those watches. In general, what I'm going to say here in this versus, it's going to be Garmin versus Polar, with the Epix and Epix Pro performing very similarly on nearly all categories. So it comes to the design and the user interface of the watches. I would say the design of the Polar really is very, very good. It is thinner than the Garmin's, and notably so. It's a really good looking watch all round. I really like how bright the screen is as well. I think Polar has done a slightly better job than Garmin in making the colours of the AMOLED screen really pop, even though it's a sapphire crystal screen. Sometimes with sapphire screens it gets a little bit dull underneath them, and that's the case I think sometimes with the Garmin, although the AMOLED screens on both of the Epix are still really, really nice. I will say that Garmin does have better watch faces though available. I think Polar's not got very many and they don't look that great so far. They're not quite as data rich as well, and Garmin has a lot more native options available, and there are loads more watch faces available in the Connect IQ app store. Also slightly prefer the general user interface on the Garmin. I think the widgets are done better. You can scroll through them more easily. You can see a lot of data quite easily. They're pretty good on the Polar though, and it'll just be a case of getting used to whichever one you buy, and they're both quite enjoyable to use day to day. One big design difference is definitely the flashlight. It is very handy on the Garmin Epix Pro, and that's for me, someone who doesn't really do anything adventurous. I use it most nights to go up and down stairs and check on kids and that kind of thing. If you're someone who's out camping a lot, having that extra flashlight on your screen is really useful, and the fact you can actually still see your screen whilst using the flashlight is also a big difference to the kind of torch mode you get on the Polar and the Epix 2. So it comes to GPS accuracy. Polar definitely took a big leap forward this year with the dual band available on the Vantage V3 and now the Grit X2 Pro. That said, overall, I do think Garmin wins out here. I think Garmin's dual band GPS accuracy is the best on the market. Suunto's is pretty much equivalent, I'd say, and both the Epix 2 and the Epix Pro have been a little bit more reliable for me than the Polar. A few little things on the Polar that just have come up to be a little bit annoyances and not quite right. It's often a bit dodgy in the first K of a run, and it takes a bit longer to lock onto GPS, and I'm wondering if sometimes it's not really locked on, because when I start a run, the pacing in the first K of a run is often a bit wrong, and then it very closely matches the pacing on the Garmin's in later stages of the run. You can see the GPS trace sometimes go completely wrong in the first K, where it's clearly said it's locked on and hasn't locked on, which is quite annoying. And then it has more runs where it will do things like cut corners, put me on the wrong side of the road, just get things slightly wrong. So it's very good GPS, but Garmin's is better, and it's notably better. Over the course of all the runs I've done with the Garmin's and the Polar, the Garmin's been very reliable for me for over a year of use, and the Polar's just thrown up more errors in the month or so I've used it than the Garmin's have in that time. And when you're comparing GPS tracks of both watches, you're just going to get a few more errors on Polar in general. I'd say outside of those first K wobbles, you can still very much pace races and pace your workouts with the Polar. The pace stats are good enough for that, so it's not a huge concern. The GPS on the Polar, like I say, is very good. I do think that Garmin wins this category quite clearly, even though the actual day-to-day difference isn't going to be that notable, and you certainly can still use the Polar to train very accurately. So when it comes to the heart rate tracking on the watches, I'd say we're quite even here. I do think the new heart rate sensor on the Epix Pro is a little better than the one on the Garmin Epix 2, but it still struggles in similar conditions. Like when it's cold, I do find that optical heart rate sensing doesn't work that well for me. These are all quite big watches. I have quite thin wrists, and I just often get errors thrown up by watches. Like they can be okay for entire runs. Sometimes they'll really nail like a very hard session or something like that when compared to a chest strap or an armband. But overall, I'd say the optical tracking on all of these three watches isn't reliable enough that I'd use it to judge all of my trainings. So if you are going to use heart rate to judge your runs, whether that's to make sure you're at the right intensity or you're taking things nice and easy, or if you're using the training analysis on any of these watches, you need to get accurate heart rate data into that. And for all of them, I would connect an external strap to make sure I was getting the most accurate data. They will be right a lot of the time, especially if you're training in warm weather conditions, where I think optical tracking works a bit better, but you are going to have enough errors from all three of them that I would say it's worth pairing an external sensor. Don't really think any of them are notably better than any of the others. Maybe the Epix Pro's new sensor is pretty good, and the Polar tracking has certainly improved from the Vantage 3 to the Grit X2 Pro. It's the same sensor, so obviously they're working on stuff behind the scenes there to keep making it more accurate, so that's promising, but it's still not something that I'd trust myself. I'd pair a sensor with all three watches. Sports tracking and training analysis. In general, I prefer Garmin sports tracking. I find it's easier to use, it's more intuitive. Things like structured workout builders, creating quick interval workouts on the watch itself. It's all much easier to do in Garmin, and it makes more sense. Polar's structured workout builder, I think, is a bit of a faff to use. You keep having to set targets. I don't think you get data presented as well on the Polar either during workouts or in general runs. You can still only have 4 data fields on the Polar, even though it's got this huge watch face, the same size as the larger Garmin, upon which you can see up to 8 stats at once. Polar restricts you to 4, which is not the end of the world, but a little annoying. One thing I do like about Polar's tracking, though, it does show your manual lap split as well as the automatic lap split. If you have that set up, you can have both of those in your data fields, which is not something that's available with Garmin. The training analysis, it can be useful on both watches if you do use an external heart rate monitor, like I mentioned. You are getting a lot more data with Garmin now, I'd say. Like Polar hasn't really pushed on this area of its watches for quite a while now, and while you still get the basics there, and they're done quite well in terms of your overall training load, kind of basic recovery advice and that kind of thing, there's a lot more going on with Garmin now. You're probably not going to use all of this stuff, like things like the endurance score and hill score and all that stuff. You might not use it very much, but it's all there, and some people will find it very useful. And that's kind of a theme with Garmin in general. There's a lot more there, and even if you think, oh, I don't need any of that, it is there, and some people will want it, and it offers you a lot more features in terms of the training analysis it has. And it also has training readiness, which is a stat that gives you that rough idea of how ready you are to train each day based on a lot of stuff like sleep and all that. Again, there'll be accuracy concerns under this, and you might not use this stat, but It's a lot easier to use that. Polar has some interesting stuff with the FitSpark, where it will recommend workouts each day, and you can check on the state of your body using the nightly recharge function and stuff like that. But overall, I'd say the Garmin's are more feature-rich in terms of training analysis, and I think it's a bit more useful. I find things like the training readiness stat a bit more practical, and also the training load analysis they have in general just a bit more applicable to what I'm doing as a runner. Comes to maps, this is obviously a big new feature for Polar added to the Vantage V3 and the Grit X2 Pro, and the maps are really good. They're very bright and colourful, they really shine on that AMOLED screen. It's very easy to see the route ahead of you if you're following a route, or just look at a map in general and get a breadcrumb trail of where you've come from. I think they're really well done. However, Garmin's maps and navigation features are better. They are the best on the market at the moment, because Garmin has routable maps that actually know where you are, so you can create routes on the fly, or it can direct you back to a trail if you've got lost, that kind of thing. They're a bit more detailed. There's also really useful extra features like Garmin's Climb Pro, which will break out all the climbs on the route and the descents, so you can judge your effort on uphills in particular, is where I find it really useful, because that individual climb is on your wrist, and you can see if it's got a twisting, switchback trail, you don't really know how far you have still to climb. The watch will give you the amount in meters and distance, so you know how long the climb is, and you can judge your effort so you don't overdo it early on. Navigation in general is just an area where Garmin is ahead of the pack. Also, in the Garmin app, you can create routes quite easily and send them to the watch, something you can't do with Polar yet. And in general, to get turn-by-turn navigation on the Polar, you have to use Komoot or something like that, or another partner app. It's a bit more faffy all round. Garmin is certainly better when it comes to navigation. Smartwatch features is another area where Garmin is a clear winner. You can get music, storage, and NFC payments on the Garmin Epix Pro and Epix 2. They both have access to the Connect IQ App Store, which is not an app store that's anything like something like the Apple App Store or Google Play, but it does have some useful apps like a parkrun barcode, and you can also get watch faces and stuff in there. Polar does have some smart features, like it's got quite a nice weather forecast widget. I really like the look of that. You obviously can get your notifications on there, and it does offer music controls, so you can control the playback of music on your paired phone if you have it with you, but obviously that's nothing like what you get with Garmin, which you can actually store music on the watch itself, and the Garmin does offer music controls as well if that's all you want to do with it. So none of them are really the match of a true smartwatch, but the Garmin's are certainly smarter than the Polar. So it comes to battery life, I found that the Garmin Epix 2 and the Polar Grit X2 Pro are pretty comparable in terms of battery life, lasting me about 4 or 5 days on a charge with pretty heavy use, running every day with the multiband GPS enabled, the always on screen enabled, and having notifications coming in, so it's not too bad, 4 or 5 days of use. I will say the Garmin's always on screen is a bit more feature-rich and detailed than the one you get from the Polar, which is just a basic digital screen or a basic analog screen. In general, the Polar seems to drain a lot more in between activities, but certainly for the inactivity use, they're pretty comparable. And Polar has quite a big headline figure for the battery life if you're using the multiband GPS mode. Also, if you can use the always on screen, have it set to quite bright, you probably won't hit the numbers listed by Polar, but it does outdo the Garmin Epix for the multiband GPS battery life for a single activity, which is obviously important if you're someone who does those big, long, ultra expeditions. And then the Garmin Epix Pro 51mm is in a different league entirely. It doubles the battery life of the others. It will last up to 10 days on a charge with the always on screen enabled, running every day. Like I say, notifications coming in. It's a bigger watch, but it certainly makes use of that size to really pack in a lot of battery life. If you have the screen set to raised away, you're going to start looking at weeks of battery life, which is obviously pretty incredible for an AMOLED watch, and it is a big step up on the smaller Epix 2 and indeed the Polar Grit X2 Pro, but you do pay quite a lot more to get the larger watch with that extra battery life. Comes to activity and sleep tracking, both do a pretty solid job of this in terms of tracking your basic stats throughout the day. Polar does a thing with steps where it will include other activities and add kind of steps on just to give you a higher step number if you're doing activities that don't necessarily involve doing a lot of steps. But I'd say all the watches are similarly useful in tracking your daily activity and making sure you're staying active in between workouts. On the sleep tracking, the Garmin is less accurate, I'd say, but it does give you a reading every single night. And this is one thing I've had with Polar watches where you do get quite nice and detailed sleep analysis from Polar, and it can be quite useful. I do think it's more accurate when it tracks, but quite a lot of the time I will wake up and the Grit X2 Pro will have no sleep data. It won't have given me the nightly recharge thing with the HRV analysis and all that, because it hasn't tracked it for some reason during the night. Maybe I was moving my wrist around too much or something like that, but that never seems to happen with Garmin or indeed other watches. So maybe the Polar sensor is a bit more sensitive and that's why it is more accurate, but that's also why it won't give me a reading sometimes. So yeah, Polar sleep tracking is probably a bit more accurate than Garmin's. Garmin does have a habit of showing light sleep when actually you're just awake but still like reading a book or watching TV or something late at night, and that obviously skews some of the other stats on the watch, but it doesn't ruin any of those stats too much. You can take that into account, and it does have that training readiness stat, which I do think is pretty useful. If you judge it over time, it does give you a good idea of the state of your body each day when compared to other days. Like recently, I actually managed to achieve the very rare score of 1 out of 100 because I had food poisoning overnight and barely slept and was throwing up and stuff like that. So you don't need a watch to tell you you're not ready to train after a night like that, but it's good it picked up on it. So when it comes to the verdict, I would say that the Polar Grit X2 Pro is the best attempt Polar has made to really run Garmin's top watches close. It's added some useful features, it's got a really nice design, it's got a really nice screen, and it would work very well as a great watch to use every day. I'd be happy to use this every single day, but you are getting more features and better features from the Garmin's, and I think it is quite telling really that the Garmin Epix 2 now came out over 2 years ago, and it is still, I would say, ahead of the best watches from other companies like Polar, who are some of the other biggest companies in this area. Garmin really is very dominant when it comes to the top end of watches, I'd say, because you're getting more features in general, and I'd say that when you are getting the same features on Garmin and other brands, Garmin is doing those features better. Things like navigation is better, things like smarts, the GPS accuracy I think edges out the Polar. All round, it just is very easy to use, and all the features are very polished. They're a bit more new on the Polar, but then even features that Polar has had for a while, they haven't really pushed on in the same way Garmin has does. Like Polar's trading analysis hasn't changed very much. Garmin keeps adding things, and you might not use all these features. That's the big thing with Garmin. Like, there are all these features there, and you might say, well, I don't want any of those, and that's fine. But some people do want them, and actually you might want just one of them, and they're all there on Garmin, and they aren't all there on the Polar watches. And even when they have them, they're just not quite as well done on the Garmin. So there are loads of things that could make you pick the Garmin over the Polars. I'd say it could be the GPS accuracy, it could be the music storage, it could be the extra navigation features, it could be the extra training analysis. There's not really anything that I pick out that would make me pick the Polar over the Garmin, although I do maybe slightly prefer the design, although I don't like the watch faces as much. So then I'd probably go back to the Garmin, because again, you've got more choice on that with the watch faces in the Connect IQ app store. But the Polar is a really nice watch. I'd be happy using it, but to make me buy it over one of these Garmin watches, it'd have to be a lot cheaper. And now, it is a fair bit cheaper than the Epix Pro, especially if you're comparing the same materials, steel versus steel, titanium versus titanium. Epix Pro is more often in sales though, so that could bring it down a bit closer, and it is a better watch. And the Garmin Epix Pro 51mm does stand out from these trio of watches because it offers so much more battery life than these AMOLED watches or other AMOLED watches I've tested, even the Suunto Race. However, the Garmin Epix 2 is not a lot more expensive than the Polar. In fact, it's cheaper randomly in the UK at the moment, and it's often in sales. That's the thing, it's an older watch. You're nearly always going to be able to find the Garmin Epix 2 cheaper than the Polar Grit X2 Pro, I'd say, and you are getting a more feature-rich and better watch, I'd say, for your money there. So Grit X2 Pro is really good. I like that Polar's made some big steps this year, but the price is high, and Garmin is so dominant in this area. To convince people to move away from them, you've got to bring some fantastic new features to the table that Garmin doesn't have, which Polar hasn't done here. They've brought new features here, which are really good, but Garmin is doing them and doing them better. It's been doing them for a while. We've got to try and undercut them, and they haven't really managed to do that. I suppose you could say they have done that with the equivalent models of the Epix Pro, but the Epix 2 is still out there, easy to get, and a better watch, and a bit cheaper. So yeah, that's where I'd probably go for it. I think the Epix Pro 51mm does stand out as a very enticing watch, but it's much more expensive. The Epix 2 is probably the best watch of this bunch in terms of features for value. The Epix Pro is the best watch. Polar is a very good watch, but it doesn't beat out either Garmin for me. That's a comparison of the Polar Grit X2 Pro and the Garmin Epix 2 and Pro. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, ring the little bell, and we'll see you next time.